All right, let's get right into it. We're diving into a powerful lecture from Kishore Mahbubani, who is, one of the world's top strategic thinkers. He makes this argument that in the world we're living in right now, which feels pretty dangerous, understanding the timeless and, let's be honest, often cruel truths of geopolitics, well, it's not just for academics anymore. It's about survival.
And right out of the gate, he hits you with this chillingly simple reminder of what's at stake. Look, in business, if you mess up, you might lose some money. But in geopolitics, a mistake means a war starts, and a lot of people die. The consequences are just devastatingly final.
So why does the world feel so much more dangerous these days? Well, according to Mahbubani, it's because our leaders have gotten arrogant. They kind of think that because we're modern and educated, we're somehow above those ancient, almost mathematical rules of power, what he calls the iron laws, that have run the world for thousands of years. And he warns that they are tragically mistaken.
So here's how we're going to break down his analysis. First, we're going to look at his pretty sobering diagnosis of how we got into this mess, using two major global conflicts as case studies. And then, we'll get to his very pragmatic prescription for how the world, especially the smaller countries, can try to navigate these incredibly treacherous waters.
Okay, so part one of the diagnosis. It all starts with the war in Ukraine. Mahbubani frames this not just as a tragedy, which of course it is, but as a colossal failure of leadership. A war that he says was completely preventable.
Now, the story we mostly hear is that the war is the result of Russia's illegal invasion. And Mahbubani agrees, yes, the invasion was illegal. But he says that's not the whole story, not by a long shot. From his point of view, a huge chunk of the blame lies with what he flat out calls the geopolitical incompetence of the West. He particularly points the finger at European leaders who, in his view, just failed to see the disaster they were walking right into.
And this gets to one of those fundamental, old-school rules of geopolitics. You just don't put a hostile force right on the border of a great power. Mahbubani points out the massive hypocrisy here, right? He reminds us that back in 1962, the U.S. took the entire world to the brink of nuclear war to stop Soviet missiles from being placed in Cuba. They were enforcing the exact same principle that they later chose to ignore when it came to Russia.
And the thing is, you can't say they weren't warned. I mean, look at this. All the way back in 1999, George Kennan, the guy who literally designed America's Cold War strategy, he explicitly said that expanding NATO would be a tragic mistake that would provoke a really hostile reaction from Russia. But for 2 decades, that warning was just ignored as NATO kept pushing east, leading, well, directly to the outcome he predicted.
And to really hammer this point home, Mahbubani shares this brutally blunt assessment he got from another giant of strategy, Henry Kissinger. Kissinger apparently told him straight up that European leaders just weren't thinking strategically anymore. They just didn't have the foresight to understand the totally predictable consequences of backing a major power like Russia into a corner.
Okay, let's shift to the second part of his diagnosis. This focuses on the biggest geopolitical contest of our time, that rivalry between the United States and China. And what he argues is that we're seeing the exact same forgotten rules of power creating yet another global flashpoint.
He boils it down to what he calls the iron law of geopolitics. And this isn't a new idea. It's a pattern that has repeated itself for over 2,000 years. Whenever a rising number 2 power gets close to overtaking the dominant number 1, the number 1 will, almost like clockwork, do everything it can to push that challenger back down. It's a structural conflict. It's almost predictable.
So why is this law kicking in right now? Well, this chart says it all. I mean, look at the staggering shift. Back in the year 2000, the U.S. economy was 8 times bigger than China's. It wasn't even a contest. But today, that gap has shrunk to almost nothing. And it's that rapid closing of the gap that has triggered that ancient defensive instinct in the number 1 power.
Mahbubani also argues that we have to be really clear-eyed here. He says the biggest lies are told in geopolitics. So when you hear politicians say, this is a contest between democracy and autocracy, he says that's a convenient story, but it's not the real reason. Think about it. If China magically became a vibrant democracy tomorrow, but kept growing economically, would the U.S. stop trying to contain it? He says no way. It's not about ideology. It's about power. It's about who gets to be number 1.
And the proof, he says, is right there in American politics. Pushing back on China is the one thing Democrats and Republicans seem to agree on. Donald Trump started the trade war, and Joe Biden, who criticized it when he was a candidate, well, he continued it. This just shows it doesn't matter who the president is, it's the geopolitical imperative, that deep structural force that's really driving the policy.
Okay, so that's the diagnosis, which is, let's face it, pretty grim. So now what? What's the prescription? What are the smaller and middle-power countries, who are caught between these giant grinding plates, supposed to do to survive?
First, he tells this little cautionary tale. Back in January 2020, a senior British official very confidently told Mahbubani that the UK would stand up to US pressure and not ban the Chinese tech company Huawei. Okay, fast forward just 6 months, and the UK had completely caved and banned them.
And that just begs the question, right? If a powerful, nuclear-armed G7 country like the United Kingdom can be forced to crumble under that kind of pressure, what chance does a much smaller nation have of standing up to it all by themselves? The answer's pretty clear. Not much.
So his advice is actually super clear and super pragmatic. Don't go it alone. Unite with your neighbors. Form regional groups, like ASEAN in Southeast Asia. Then, as a group, agree to stay neutral. Don't pick a side. Because by speaking with one unified voice, you create a bloc that is way, way harder for the big powers to bully and divide.
But Mahbubani offers a second and maybe more hopeful piece of advice. And this one isn't just for small nations. This one's for all of us. He explains it with a really simple but profound analogy.
So think of it like this. In the past, you could imagine the world's 193 countries as 193 totally separate boats floating on the ocean. If one boat got into trouble, sprang a leak, or even sank, it was a huge tragedy for the people on that boat. But the other boats could just keep sailing on, mostly unaffected.
But that's not our world anymore. Not even close. Today, we don't live in separate boats. We live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. And as the pandemic just showed us so clearly, when a fire or a virus breaks out in one cabin, it threatens absolutely everyone on board. Our fates are completely tangled up together now.
And this leads to such a powerful question. If the entire boat is taking on water, does it really matter who has the biggest, most luxurious cabin? The whole idea of the great powers fighting over who gets to be captain seems kind of absurd when the whole ship is at risk of going under.
And let's be clear, the threats to our shared boat are real and they are huge. We're talking about pandemics, climate change, global financial meltdowns, international terrorism. These are the kinds of problems that no single country, no matter how powerful it is, can possibly solve on its own. These are the things that demand we work together, not fight each other.
So in the end, Mahbubani leaves us with this massive dilemma. Are we just doomed to repeat these cruel 2,000-year-old patterns of power politics, living by the laws of the jungle? Or can we finally wake up, recognize our shared fate, and actually start acting like we are, in fact, all in the same boat? The answer to that question is going to define everything.